G'day YouTube, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about the brand new FSC24 Chaser from FMS Hobby. It's a 1/24 scale short course truck, which is something a little bit different for this channel. Normally we're focusing on rock crawlers. This is more of a backyard basher style vehicle. We'll have a look under the hood. We'll take a look at some size comparisons with other small scale vehicles within the mini off-road category. We're going to have a look at some of the positives and negatives, and of course we'll get the thing out in the dirt and see how it performs. So if you're interested in finding out more, stick around, it's coming right up. The first thing I want to take a look at is the size of the truck. I think it's a question that's going to come up pretty early on in the conversation for a lot of people. Within the 1/24 scale there seems to be a lot of variability in size, so we'll just get it out of the way. We'll take some measurements and talk about the actual size of this truck, and we'll take a look in comparison to some other vehicles. So width across the front, right around 140 millimeters, give or take a little bit. Across the back axle, we've got 138 millimeters. Basically, it's slightly wider across the front axle than it is across the rear axle. We'll have a look at some direct size comparisons. Here we've got the SCX24 base cam, obviously significantly wider on that front axle. Sits at a similar height. And then you can see side on, the body is quite a bit longer and makes the truck look a fair bit bigger, even though the wheelbase is only slightly longer on the Chaser. We'll do the same with the Mias Racing MB24. With that full body on it, it does look considerably larger. And then we've got a Traxxas TRX 4M Bronco for size comparison. Probably more comparable in size to the Bronco, even though the wheelbase on the Chaser is a little bit shorter. We'll go ahead and remove the body so we can take a look at the chassis layout itself, which is an excellent opportunity to talk about the clipless body mounting system. It just involves these two tabs that you squeeze in, identical front and rear, and they clip into these little receptacles at the front and back of the chassis. It's a little bit fiddly, but it does work quite well. The body has not fallen off, with quite a bit of rough and tumble use, a lot of crashes, a lot of cartwheels, and that body has stayed stuck to the vehicle really well. It may not be perfect because it's a tiny little bit fiddly. Sometimes you've really got to press the thing down to make sure that it clips on, but I would rather have this setup than body posts and pins. I think this is a much nicer system to live with. With the body off, you can see the general layout. There's a lot of equipment jammed into a pretty tight space. There's not a lot of real estate on this chassis, so everything ends up being kind of stacked up in the middle and stacked up quite high over the center line of the vehicle. But the width of the vehicle ensures that the center of gravity still feels fairly low. It still handles well. The front section of the vehicle is borrowed from the FMT24. It's a Chevy Colorado 1/24 scale monster truck, and it looks like an identical carbon copy. The front half, all the suspension arms and everything look the identical length. We've got a pivot ball style front suspension. It's fairly reminiscent of a 1/8 scale off-road buggy. We've got fairly good spring rates, front and rear, oil damped shocks as well. We've also got threaded preload collars, which makes adjusting the preload to your taste or terrain easily. You can see a pair of servos there. We've got Metal Gear servos, one of them dedicated to steering and one of them dedicated to shifting the 2-speed transmission. Having a look at the steering gear below this top platform where the servos are mounted, it almost looks as though you could rig this thing up for dual steering servos. If you weren't worried about the 2-speed transmission and you wanted to just jam this in second gear and leave it there, it looks as though you could nearly set this thing up with dual steering servos, which would be pretty cool depending on how you intend to run the vehicle. We've got a relatively large 370 size motor. As it turns out, that's actually a good amount of power for this little vehicle. The speed is decent. You can do some good jumps with it. It feels like they've got the gearing set up really well in terms of the motor. It doesn't get too hot. You spend a lot of time at full throttle with this little guy, and the motor warms up, but not to the point where you burn yourself on it. So it feels as though that's set up fairly well. We've got a typical integrated receiver ESC like many of FMS's small scale vehicles. We've also got a 900 milliamp 2S LiPo pack with an XT30 connector on there. The suspension performance feels pretty decent out in the dirt. I ran it this morning. It was pretty cold outside, and it may have been a little bit over damped for that cold weather, but I think in warmer weather it's probably set up fairly well. It doesn't seem to bounce a lot. It does have a tendency to kick the back end up, and we'll talk about why I think that happens in a little bit. The rear suspension is a lot stiffer than the front end, as you can see there. In terms of steering performance, it looks as though it runs a fairly typical dual bell crank system. It does feel a little slow on steering performance. The steering feels strong enough, but in my opinion, for the speed of the vehicle, feels like the servo is just a little bit on the slow side. Looking at the steering gear itself, I don't see any servo savers, so time will tell whether high-speed crashes will be transferred to those servo gears. So far, I've been pretty rough with the truck, and it's held up really well. I mentioned earlier that the front suspension's considerably softer in comparison to the rear. As I was playing with the rear suspension, I noticed that about 2/3 of the way into the travel, the suspension really starts to stiffen up, and it feels like you have to press it a fair bit harder to get full stroke out of those rear shocks. I wanted to know what was causing that phenomenon. I thought it might have been this upper link binding on part of the chassis. A closer look showed that it was actually the rear driveshaft binding. So as you can see here, we've got a bit of front to rear play in that shaft. And then as we cycle the suspension all the way up, that completely tightens up and that shaft can no longer move. It's completely bound up in there. You could hear in that video clip as I compressed the rear suspension, the driveline gets loaded up and you can actually hear the pitch of the motor change. It may lead to premature wear and tear of things like this dog bone, its related drive cups, and possibly even the bearings at the transmission and differential ends. So that's something that isn't fantastic. The wheels and tires on this vehicle are fairly interesting. You can see it looks like we've got a fairly standard 1-inch 1/24 scale rim, but when we look on the back side of it, we've got a very low profile, which is fairly reminiscent of the 110 scale short course vehicles. And the reason they've done that is to clear the pivot ball suspension on the front. That's going to make changing the wheels and tires difficult on this vehicle. In terms of the performance of the tires themselves, they're vented. They don't have a foam in them. For general use, I feel like they're pretty adequate on firmer terrain. Once you start running in really slippery terrain like I did this morning, and you'll see that in the running video, a lot of gravel, a lot of sand, I feel like the traction from these tires could be better. So I want to show you what I came up with so that we could use different wheels and tires from our existing 1/24 and 1/18 scale crawlers. The solution that I was able to come up with to prevent the back of the wheel from crashing into the front upright, I came up with these extended brass hexes. These started life as a TRX4M plus 2mm, I believe. I did have to modify them. They did not slide onto the axles at all. I had to drill them out to 4mm internal diameter, and for the rear, all I did was drill them out and left the hex otherwise completely stock. I made no other changes for it. The front was a little bit more challenging. You can see at the back of the hex there's a little flange. For the front, I actually had to grind that little flange down. I'm not sure on the exact measurements of that, but I just kind of eyeballed it. And then the actual thickness across the hex itself, I had to grind that down to a width of 5mm. There we've got all 4 tyres installed. As you can see, it is wider. There's no two ways about it. If you want to install a different wheel and tyre combination, you do have to space the wheels out. So it adds width to the vehicle, but I think it is a workable solution, and I think it's a great option to be able to use a bunch of different wheels and tyres. I have run the vehicle for a short amount of time with this wheel and tyre setup, and I'll probably do a follow-up video when I've had the opportunity to dig through my foams and maybe firm those wheels up, maybe try a few different tread patterns and things like that, and see what sort of a wheel and tyre combination I can settle on that really performs well. Well, that covers everything I wanted to talk about on the new FSC24 platform. The only thing left to do is to get this thing out into the dirt, put it through its paces, and see what sort of performance we get out of it. So I started out in this gravel parking lot in second gear doing some high-speed passes, just testing the suspension and steering of the vehicle. However, the bumps were a little bit on the large side and it was difficult to hold the truck in a straight line, as you can see, but it was fun just putting it through its paces and seeing what it could do. The next thing that I wanted to test was how effective the first gear was for low speed trail type driving, like on this bank covered in tree roots, and it doesn't do too badly. It does give you a lot more control. However, with open front and rear differentials, it really does limit the type of terrain that you can take on with this vehicle. And then finally, just on the other side of a small creek on this baseball diamond that was washed out during Hurricane Helene, I think I found the perfect terrain for testing this vehicle. This is at top speed in second gear, and with the video running at normal speed, it's a little bit dizzying to watch. So the next thing that I want to do is to run some slow-mo footage so you can really concentrate on the truck. So with the help of some beautiful morning light, I think I finally got the footage that I was looking for. I finally found some terrain that was really fun to drive the truck on. So I'm just going to stop talking and I'm going to let you sit back and enjoy the ride. Hopefully you could see from that running footage there that this actually is a really fun little truck to drive. It handles pretty decently, it jumps well, and it is a blast just to tear around in the dirt. Speed wise, I feel like the speed is pretty good. The power system, it seems well designed. The motor doesn't get too hot. I think the speed is fast enough to be fun without being overpowered for a kid to learn to drive. So I feel like that is a pretty good balance for this little vehicle. I think the first gear is going to be a little bit confusing for some people. When you drop this thing down into first gear, it does allow you to negotiate tighter, more technical obstacles. However, you quickly figure out that you run out of traction with open front and rear diffs. It really limits how steep and how gnarly of terrain that you can negotiate with this thing. So I'm probably going to experiment with maybe locking that rear diff with some blue tack or silicone earplug or similar, and just seeing what impact that has on the vehicle's performance, whether we can sort of strike a better balance between low speed control and high speed functionality. I think that'll be a fun experiment. That's about where we're going to wrap things up for today, guys. If you got any value out of today's video, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you've got any questions regarding this little truck, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.